This is Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador. Hold on, let me get a better picture. Hell yeah. Now, he is often referred to as AMLO, which is just an acronym of his name. And when he became president, he espoused this idea that his plan for Mexico was to take it through a fourth transformation. And the reason that it's a fourth transformation is because he states that Mexico has gone through three other transformations. The first being Mexico's independence, the second being the Reform War, which happened in 1857, and the third being the Mexican Revolution, which happened from 1910 to 1920. Now, the Reform War, which again occurred in 1857, was a pretty catastrophic civil war that happened in Mexico's history between Mexican conservatives and Mexican liberals, sparked by the promulgation of the 1857 Constitution. This constitution essentially intended to secularize Mexico in one way by limiting the power of the Catholic Church, by expropriating a lot of its property, and essentially limiting its influence on Mexico as a whole by, for instance, making Catholicism no longer Mexico's official religion. And it implemented things like a separation of church and state, secular education. It limited the privileges given to like the military class, things like that. And Mexican conservatives were not about it. So a 3-year civil war sparked that ultimately the conservatives lost. The thing is that although the liberals won, what they inherited from this war was a nation brought to its knees, considering that so much of its infrastructure and its finances were just completely decimated. Mexico was absolutely broke. And what sucked about that is that not only the liberals, but the conservatives as well borrowed money during that entire 3-year period, to fund their war effort, to try to win that civil war. And so they owed a lot of money to nations like the United Kingdom, Spain, France, but they had no money to pay it back. And at the same time, Mexican conservatives couldn't handle the fact that they fucking lost. So they ran across the pond to France, to the Second French Empire, and asked Napoleon to invade Mexico. Now, initially, Napoleon III did not want to do this because invading Mexico would elicit a reaction from the United States due to the Monroe Doctrine, and he didn't want the smoke. Although France was interested in setting up some sort of puppet government in the Americas that would be friendly to French interests. So although he didn't really want to invade Mexico, he wasn't entirely against the idea, especially with a little bit of pushing from his wife. Now, a few things happened. For one, the United States had its own conservatives spark a civil war for the entire purpose of maintaining slavery, of being able to own an entire race of people that they saw as inferior. This meant that while the United States was at war with itself, it could not enforce the Monroe Doctrine. So now, if the French invaded, they wouldn't have to fear any sort of reaction from the United States because they were too busy fighting themselves. But the other thing that happened was that Mexico's president at the time, Benito Juarez, stopped paying Mexico's debt. He put a moratorium on debt payments for 2 years. And now France used this as an excuse to invade Mexico. However, they knew that doing so would be seen negatively on the world stage, so they invited the United Kingdom and Spain to do it with them, under the guise that they were going to Mexico to force Benito Juarez's government to continue making, their debt payments. Of course, France's entire intent was to meddle in Mexican affairs, and when the United Kingdom and Spain found this out, they made their own independent agreement with the Mexican government and ultimately withdrew their troops from Mexican territory. Meanwhile, France commenced what would later become known as the Second French Intervention and would go on to establish the Second Mexican Empire. Again, all of this being done at the behest of Mexican conservatives, Mexican monarchists who had lost the Reform War and ran off to Europe to sell their own country out to France. And it is during this time period, during the Second French Intervention in Mexico, that we get Cinco de Mayo, May 5th, which was the Battle of Puebla, where a ragtag army of around 4,000 to 4,500 Mexicans, made up of some Mexican soldiers and a lot of farmers and peasants who were under-equipped, who were overwhelmed, who were often undertrained, who many of them weren't even fighting with firearms, faced off against a larger force of about 6,000 to 6,500 French. And this is during a time when the French Empire's military was considered among one of the best equipped, best trained in the world. French victory over the Mexican force seemed assured. It seemed to guarantee. And it was such that the general of the French army, Charles de Lorenzes, was so sure of his military might that he wrote back to the French emperor, to Napoleon, that he, at the head of a 6,000 strong army, was the master of Mexico. In fact, he stated that not only were the French superior in number and in equipment and training, but they were superior in race. Of course, we know that he lost. He lost that battle. He lost the Battle of Puebla, although ultimately, a year later, the French would come back and take Puebla with a much larger force. And ultimately, yes, the French were successful in establishing the Second Mexican Empire, a puppet government. However, ultimately, Mexico was able to continue fighting, deposing that Second French Empire, that puppet government, kicking out the French, and reestablishing the Second Federal Republic, of course, with help from the United States. After its civil war was won by the Union, they sent support to Mexico to help them retake their country. Now, I'm making this video kind of talking about events on May 5th, well after May 5th. In fact, this year, I didn't really make a May 5th video like I've done in previous years. But there's a reason that I'm bringing it up. And the reason that I'm bringing it up is it's a bit political. And it's because as Cinco de Mayo celebrations were happening and I was going through my IG feed, I saw several conservative Mexican accounts celebrating Cinco de Mayo. A couple of Lexit Levas were in the mix, and I couldn't help but laugh at the irony of Mexican conservatives celebrating a Mexican liberal victory over an enemy that Mexican conservatives of the past had invited over. I saw the irony in watching these sellouts celebrating a liberal victory over other Mexican sellouts. I just found it humorous, I should say, very humorous, to see Mexican conservatives celebrating Cinco de Mayo, when if it had been back then, they would have been the same motherfuckers opening the gates for the French.